Can faith exist without symbols? When a reporter challenges Karoline's beliefs, her response will make you rethink everything you thought you knew about authenticity. The room was tense, the air thick with anticipation, as the camera crews adjusted their lenses. Karoline sat across from the reporter, her posture straight and composed, a quiet strength radiating from her presence. The reporter, Michael, a seasoned journalist with a reputation for grilling his subjects, was prepared for what he thought would be a typical interview. He had done his research on Karoline. She was known for her unshakable faith, the kind that seemed to define everything about her. But today, he wanted to test the limits of that faith. He wanted to expose the cracks, if there were any. The lights above hummed, and the interviewer signaled for the cameras to roll. Michael's voice echoed in the studio, projecting an air of superiority. "So, Karoline," he began, his tone just a little too smooth, "you've spoken often about your faith, about how it's the foundation of your life. But I've noticed something interesting today. No cross. Seems like faith is just for show." The words hit her like a slap in the face, but Karoline's eyes remained steady, her hands resting calmly on her lap. There was a brief moment of silence before she responded. Michael's expression suggested he expected a reaction. A flicker of insecurity, perhaps. He'd seen it before in others, but not in Karoline. Karoline's faith was something that had been with her her entire life. It wasn't something she wore as a badge or a symbol to show others that she was good or righteous. To her, faith was a deeply personal, internal part of who she was. It didn't require external validation, nor did it need to be displayed in the form of a cross around her neck or etched into her clothing. It was embedded in her every action, her every thought, and most importantly, in how she treated others. But Michael had made the assumption that because she wasn't wearing the familiar symbol, her faith was somehow less genuine. She could feel the weight of the question, but it didn't faze her. Instead of reacting the way most people might, defensively, even angrily, Karoline simply met Michael's eyes with a quiet, unwavering gaze. She'd been in similar situations before. Questions designed to provoke, designed to unsettle. But this one felt different. This wasn't about her. This was about something deeper. As she sat there, considering her response, the reporter shifted in his seat. He had expected her to flinch, to apologize for not adhering to the expectations others placed on her. But Karoline didn't need to apologize. Not now. Not ever. He leaned forward, sensing an opportunity to press further. "It's just curious," he said with a smirk. "You preach about the importance of faith, but without the symbols, without the outward sign of your beliefs, it seems like, well, maybe it's just a facade." The accusation was thinly veiled, and it wasn't lost on Karoline. He wanted her to expose herself, to reveal some vulnerability that he could use against her. He was hoping for a breakdown, any sign of weakness that would make the interview more interesting. But Karoline knew something Michael didn't. Her faith wasn't for him. It wasn't for anyone watching or listening. It was for her. A moment of tension filled the space between them, but Karoline remained composed. She didn't rush to answer. She wasn't going to let his words dictate her emotions or reactions. Instead, she allowed the silence to stretch, making him uncomfortable. But Karoline wasn't about to be shaken so easily. She knew the moment to speak had arrived. Michael's patience began to wear thin as he watched Karoline sit there, calm and collected, as though his question had barely registered. He had expected a defensive reaction, perhaps even an apology. But instead she was still, unmoved. He could sense her calmness, but he wasn't about to let it go. In his mind, she was simply a woman of faith trying to hide behind a facade of quiet confidence. If she wasn't going to take the bait, he would have to press harder. "Well, Karoline," he continued, leaning forward slightly, the microphone picking up every word. You speak about faith all the time, but I think the world's seen enough of people who wear their beliefs on their sleeves. There are plenty of faithful people out there who claim one thing and do another, so tell me, how do we know you're not just another example of that? Karoline didn't flinch. Her eyes remained locked on him, and she slowly adjusted her posture as if preparing herself for a conversation that required more than just a simple answer. Her voice, when it came, was steady. I don't wear my faith to prove anything to anyone, she replied, her words measured, deliberate. My actions speak louder than any cross, any title, any symbol I could wear. The words were simple, yet they carried weight. But Michael wasn't ready to let it go that easily. He was still searching for a crack, a moment where she would slip up. He pressed further, a little more forcefully now. Actions, huh? Michael smirked. But what about the times when those actions seem to be more about you than about your faith? When people can't tell the difference between the things you do for attention and the things you do out of genuine belief? He paused, watching her closely. Doesn't that bother you? A shift in the air seemed to happen. Karoline's expression didn't change, but the quiet strength she carried began to grow more apparent. She wasn't angry, but something in her eyes flickered, a spark of clarity, as if she was finally letting him into a deeper part of herself. Faith isn't about what others think of me, she said, her voice remaining calm, but now with a slight edge to it. It's about the work I do, the good I can bring into the world. If you're looking for a show, you'll find none here. I don't answer to the crowd, and I don't need validation from anyone. Michael didn't back down. So, you're saying it's just about you and the good you do, and everyone else can just figure it out for themselves? Karoline smiled, the slightest hint of a knowing smile. No, she said softly, almost as if to herself. I'm saying it's about making a difference, even if no one ever sees it. It's about staying true to what I believe in regardless of whether people understand it or not. Michael's face darkened. He had expected an easier target, someone who would be rattled, caught off guard by the accusation. Instead, he was met with calmness, an unwavering belief that seemed to root Karoline even deeper into the conversation. She wasn't moving. She wasn't reacting with the defensiveness he had hoped for. And that, in itself, was unnerving. See, he muttered, leaning back slightly, still trying to regain control of the interview. But you know, Karoline, the world isn't all about personal beliefs, is it? What if the world judges you? What if they don't see your good? A long pause stretched between them. And this time, it was Karoline who leaned forward, her voice dropping to a soft, unwavering whisper that seemed to cut through the tension like a blade. If the world judges me, Michael, she said, the words deliberate, then that's their choice. But I won't change who I am to fit their standards. That's the essence of faith, isn't it? Not changing who you are to fit in, but staying true to what you know is right. Michael's eyes flickered, and for a moment, the air in the room seemed to grow heavier. He had expected a confrontation, but instead, he found himself caught in a moment of clarity. A moment where his own beliefs about the world felt questioned. But Karoline wasn't finished yet. Her response had merely opened the door to something far deeper, and Michael was about to find that out the hard way. As Michael sat back in his chair, the weight of Karoline's words hung in the air. For the first time in the interview, he seemed to falter. The smugness that had defined his questions slipped away. He'd expected to provoke anger, fear, or at least a hint of defensiveness. Instead, he had stirred something deeper, a quiet strength that was impossible to challenge. But Karoline wasn't finished. She could feel the moment stretching out between them, a stillness that filled the room with unspoken thoughts. The reporter's challenge, his attempt to undermine her faith, had been blunt. But she had learned long ago that some battles were won not by words alone, but by the ability to remain still, patient, and true to oneself. For a brief moment, she looked away from him, her eyes focused on a small detail in the studio, a picture on the wall, a simple landscape that had caught her eye earlier. It was a place she recognized, a distant town she had once visited on a retreat. A quiet place, far removed from the chaos of the world, where people lived in harmony with themselves, not chasing validation from anyone. She had been drawn to that place years ago for its simplicity, its authenticity. And in that moment, she found herself reflecting on why she was sitting here, answering questions from a reporter who seemed more intent on exposing her contradictions than understanding her. Was it because she needed to justify herself? No. She realized that her faith was something far beyond that. It wasn't a show, a performance, or something that could be shaken by anyone's doubts or questions. It was the foundation of everything she did, whether the world understood it or not. She let out a slow breath, feeling the tension in her chest begin to ease. Her response had been calm, but now it felt more than just a reaction to the reporter's words. It was a realization, an understanding of how far she had come. In her own spiritual journey, faith was not something that could be reduced to a simple image or symbol. It was about how she lived each day, how she treated others, and how she responded to the world around her. As the silence stretched, the weight of it seemed to settle over the studio, and the intensity of the moment grew. Michael's voice had fallen silent, perhaps for the first time in the interview, unsure of how to continue. He had prodded, pressed, and mocked, but Karoline had responded not with hostility, but with something far more powerful, a quiet, unwavering conviction. It was in this moment that she realized something profound. This wasn't just about faith. This was about authenticity. This was about standing firm in who you are, regardless of the world's expectations. Karoline had learned that the most powerful responses weren't always the loudest. They were the quiet ones, the ones that didn't seek to be heard but were impossible to ignore. The room was still, but it was alive with a subtle tension. The reporter's eyes darted back and forth, his mind racing for his next question. But for Karoline, the battle wasn't about words anymore. It was about being true to herself, no matter how hard others tried to tear at the fabric of her beliefs. And then, as if sensing the finality in the air, Michael asked one last question, a question he thought might finally break her resolve. The silence stretched longer than Michael had intended. He shifted in his chair, uneasy now, as if his entire strategy was crumbling before him. Karoline's quiet confidence had thrown him off guard. He had expected to provoke her, to make her angry or defensive. But instead, she had only deepened the silence around them. It was as if she was not just sitting in front of him, but standing in a space entirely separate, unshaken by his words. Finally, Michael broke the silence, leaning forward once again, his voice just a bit more forceful than before. So you really think the world should just accept that, Karoline? That faith is something that doesn't need to be seen or acknowledged? That people don't need to understand why you believe what you do? He paused, his eyes narrowing as he tried to find her weakness. Isn't it a little hypocritical to talk about faith without showing it in the way that people expect? Karoline let the question sit in the air for a moment, allowing herself the space to think. The weight of his words was different now. It wasn't about anger or indignation. It was about understanding the place she had reached in her own heart and the clarity she had gained over the years. Her eyes softened, and she met his gaze squarely. "Michael," she said, her voice calm but unwavering, "faith is not a performance. It's not a spectacle for others to applaud. It's not something I wear like a costume, like a symbol to be recognized. Faith is something that lives in the heart, in the actions and how we treat each other." It's about the choices I make, not the outward signs I display. If people can't see it because it's not shining through some outward gesture, then that's not my problem." She paused, her gaze steady. "That's between them and what they believe faith is supposed to look like." The words hit Michael harder than he expected. For the first time in the interview, he felt a subtle shift. Something in the air around him had changed. Karoline wasn't arguing. She wasn't trying to prove herself to him or to anyone. She was simply stating the truth as she saw it, without the need for validation. And the clarity in her voice made it difficult for him to respond, as though he was suddenly questioning his own assumptions about faith, about how people chose to live their beliefs. Her eyes never left his as she continued. "People spend so much time trying to measure the faith of others. They think it's something to be judged, something to be weighed and evaluated based on how loudly you proclaim it or what you wear. But that's not what faith is about. Faith is about holding on to something in the quiet moments when no one is watching. It's about loving others, forgiving them, being kind when it's easier to be angry. That's what faith looks like." She leaned forward slightly, her tone becoming even more resolute, as if she was speaking not only to Michael, but to anyone who had ever misunderstood the depth of her faith. "And yes, sometimes people judge. They look at me and they assume things about what I wear, how I speak, where I choose to show up. But you know what? I'm not here to convince them of anything. I'm here to live the truth of what I believe, whether they understand it or not." The words hung in the air, heavy and clear. Michael sat back, blinking, as if processing the enormity of what had just been said. He had expected to draw out something from Karoline, anger, shame, perhaps an apology for not meeting his expectations. Instead, he had encountered someone whose peace was not for sale, whose strength didn't rely on how others viewed her. She didn't need to prove anything. For a long moment, Michael didn't speak. The studio was so still that the faint hum of the cameras was all that could be heard. Karoline sat in the calm after the storm of words, unwavering and resolute. Her faith, a quiet, powerful presence in the room. The interview had changed. The reporter, once in control, now found himself speechless, caught in the web of his own assumptions about what faith should look like. The room was heavy with the aftermath of Karoline's words. For a moment, it felt as though the world had come to a standstill. Michael, the seasoned reporter known for his quick wit and sharp tongue, sat frozen, his mouth open slightly as if searching for something to say. But the words wouldn't come. The interview had gone completely off script, and he was now adrift in an unfamiliar place, caught between his own expectations and the truth that Karoline had just presented him. The cameras kept rolling, the bright lights casting long shadows across the room, but the atmosphere had shifted. The energy that once hovered around Michael's attempts to provoke now felt faint, like an old echo. Karoline, on the other hand, seemed more grounded than ever. Her presence, even more pronounced in the silence that followed. She sat back in her chair, not with a sense of triumph, but with the quiet assurance of someone who had simply spoken the truth. A beat passed, and the sound of the studio's clock ticking became the loudest thing in the room. Michael cleared his throat, his hand instinctively reaching for the stack of notes on his desk. But it was clear that nothing he had written down could fix this. He had expected a confrontation, a moment where Karoline would crack, a point where he could attack her beliefs or make her stumble. Instead, she had answered with something he hadn't anticipated, a clarity of conviction that left no room for doubt. For a moment, Michael wondered if his career was at a crossroads. He had prided himself on exposing hypocrisy, on making people answer for their actions. But now, he was faced with something he hadn't counted on, a person whose faith was beyond reproach, whose actions spoke for themselves. Karoline had done something far more profound than defend herself. She had offered him a mirror. His questions, designed to break her, had only served to reveal his own biases. The camera zoomed in on Karoline as she sat there, unshaken, while Michael scrambled to regain control of the interview. His usual bravado was gone, replaced by a subtle unease. He turned to the monitor beside him, glancing at the producer for some direction. But the producer only shrugged. There was nothing left to say. This interview had taken on a life of its own. Karoline's eyes never wavered from Michael, but now there was a slight softening in her expression. She wasn't angry. She wasn't smug. She was simply there, present in a way that was almost disarming. She had responded not just with words, but with an inner peace that spoke volumes. And in that moment, it became clear to everyone in the room, including Michael, that this interview had shifted from a battle of words to a battle of values, a contest that Karoline had already won. The tension in the room gradually dissolved, replaced by a quiet realization. Michael had sought to expose weakness, but instead, he had uncovered strength. Karoline wasn't just a woman of faith. She was a woman who lived her truth, regardless of how the world saw her. And in the end, that was more powerful than any mocking remark or challenge could ever be. As the cameras kept rolling, Michael forced a smile, though it was strained and lacking conviction. "Well, Karoline," he said, trying to regain some semblance of control, "I think we've covered everything for today." But the words felt hollow now. There was no sharpness in his voice, no biting edge. The interview was over, not because of any dramatic conclusion, but because Karoline had made her point, and in doing so had made him rethink his own approach. The crew began to pack up, and as the room slowly emptied, Karoline stood up from her chair, a quiet smile touching her lips. She hadn't just answered a question. She had shared a piece of herself with the world. And it was clear that her message had been heard, not just by Michael, but by everyone who had witnessed the exchange. But for Karoline, the victory wasn't in silencing Michael or proving a point. It was in living her truth, undeterred by the judgment of others. As the interview wrapped up and the crew began packing away equipment, the room that had once buzzed with the tension of confrontation now felt quieter, almost reverent. Karoline moved toward the exit, her posture just as graceful and steady as when she had entered. The lights, now dimming, couldn't take away from the peaceful aura she exuded. She wasn't walking away from a victory. She was walking away from the truth she had simply shared, unwavering and unchanged. The producer, who had been in the back corner throughout the interview, approached Karoline as she stepped off set. He was silent for a moment, collecting his thoughts. When he finally spoke, his words were hesitant, almost as if he weren't sure how to frame what had just happened. "Karoline," he began, his voice thoughtful, "I've been in this business for a long time. I've seen a lot of interviews, but that was different. You didn't just stand your ground, you changed the entire dynamic of the conversation." Karoline smiled, but there was no pride in it. Just quiet acknowledgement. "It wasn't about changing anything, really," she said, her voice soft but clear. "It was about staying true to who I am, no matter how it's received." The producer nodded slowly, still processing her words. He had expected an argument, a struggle, a dramatic final answer that would bring clarity to the interview. Instead, he had witnessed something deeper, something that didn't need a theatrical display of emotion or conflict. Karoline had simply stood firm in her faith, and it was in her calm strength that the message had been delivered. As Karoline left the studio, her steps light, her thoughts quiet, the events of the day settled into perspective. She had known the importance of holding on to her faith in moments like this, when the world seemed to want an answer that could fit into its narrow view of what belief should look like. But in her heart, she knew the truth. Faith was not something to be showcased for others. It was something to be lived. The lesson was clear, not just for Michael or the crew, but for anyone watching. The true power of faith doesn't lie in what can be seen or measured by others. It is found in the moments of silence, in the quiet acts of kindness, in the way we live when no one is watching. Faith isn't a show. It's a journey of conviction and authenticity. Karoline had proven that, even in a world that often equates worth with outward symbols, it is the internal belief that matters most. And when we live from that place of truth, we cannot be shaken by the judgments of others. As the final shot of the interview aired, Karoline's message spread beyond the screen. It wasn't just about faith, it was about how we define ourselves in a world that constantly tries to define us. It was about embracing our convictions, standing firm in our truths, and letting our actions speak louder than any symbol or outward expression could. For those who had been moved by her words, the message was simple yet profound. Stand firm in who you are, in what you believe, and in how you treat others. Do not let the noise of the world force you to change your core beliefs. Live authentically and unapologetically, and in the end, the world will come to recognize the strength that lies in your quiet conviction. Because at the end of the day, it's the quiet strength within us that leaves the greatest impact, and that is something worth holding on to, no matter what anyone else says. As the screen faded to black, viewers were left with the question, how do you live your truth in a world that wants to define it for you?